The morning Gerald left the house he'd lived in for 31 years, he didn't look back. Not because he wasn't hurting. He was. But the lawyer had made it very clear. The property had been in Carolyn's name since 2003. And when she passed, it transferred automatically to the estate. And the estate belonged to their daughter now. Their daughter who had married a man named Philip Crown. And Philip Crown had decided, with the particular coldness of someone who has never once needed anything from another person, that a 68-year-old retired veteran with a bad knee and a Labrador retriever named Scout did not fit into his plans for the property. Gerald had 30 days. He used 29 of them pretending it wasn't happening. The 32nd morning, he loaded what was left of his life into the back of his old Silverado, 2 duffel bags, a box of Carolyn's photographs he couldn't bring himself to leave, a toolbox, and Scout's bed, which Scout refused to get into because he was already in the cab, sitting straight in the passenger seat, like he was the one driving. Gerald locked the front door from habit, slid the key under the mat, then stood there on the porch, for a moment longer than he intended. He thought about Vietnam. He thought about the 18 months he spent in a fire support base outside Kontum in 1974, sleeping in the same clothes for 2 weeks at a stretch, eating whatever was available, learning to be grateful for any surface that wasn't wet. You don't forget that kind of living. It settles into the bones. And standing on that porch in the cold October air of Bracebridge, Ontario, Gerald Sutton told himself he knew how to do hard things. He had done hard things. He could do this too. Scout pressed his nose against the passenger window and fogged it up. Gerald got in and drove. He had one real option, and he knew it. His father's land, 80 acres of mixed bush and field out past Magnetawan, where a farmhouse and a collapsing barn had been sitting empty since his father, Ellis Sutton, passed 3 years prior. Gerald had meant to deal with it sooner. He had meant to do a lot of things sooner. The estate had cleared, the taxes were paid up through a small inheritance, and the land sat there waiting, unhurried, the way land always does. He hadn't been there in 6 years. The drive north took nearly 3 hours. The highway narrowed to County Road to gravel, and the gravel road ended at a rusted gate that Gerald had to get out and lift from the bottom because it had settled into the ground at an angle. The lane beyond it was barely visible. 2 shallow tracks through tall grass that had gone bronze with the season. The maples along the fence line had dropped most of their leaves. The farmhouse sat at the end of the lane exactly as he remembered it. Gray clapboard siding, a sagging porch, windows filmed with grime, but somehow smaller than memory had kept it. Scout was out of the truck before Gerald had the door fully open, nose sweeping the ground in long urgent arcs, tail going hard, moving toward the barn, and then away from it, and then back again, reading the whole property in a language Gerald had never learned. The inside of the farmhouse smelled like his father, old wood and engine grease, and something faintly sweet, like the molasses his father used to keep in the back of the pantry. The kitchen table was still there, the hook by the door where his father had kept his cap. Gerald stood in the middle of the kitchen and breathed it in and didn't move for a while. The electricity had been disconnected. He'd known that. He had a camp lantern in the truck and propane and a sleeping bag rated to -20. He was fine. He was going to be fine. That first week was harder than he admitted to himself. The nights were long and close. The farmhouse creaked and popped in the cold, and every sound felt personal, in a way sounds never do when there are other people in a house. Gerald had been sleeping alone since Carolyn passed 14 months ago. But this was a different kind of alone. Older, emptier, stripped of the furniture and photos and small routines that make a place feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. He got the power restored. He fixed a section of the porch railing that had rotted through. He stacked wood. He kept himself moving because stopping felt dangerous in a way he couldn't quite name. Scout helped with this. Scout was a 7-year-old yellow lab who had been trained initially as a service dog before Gerald had adopted him through a veterans program. trained to sense changes in Gerald's stress levels, to provide pressure and grounding when the old nightmares came back hard, to wake him if his breathing changed in certain ways during sleep. In 31 years of marriage, Carolyn had done many of these things without knowing that's what she was doing. Scout did them knowingly, deliberately, with the quiet confidence of an animal who understood his purpose. At night, Scout slept pressed against Gerald's legs, and this mattered more than Gerald would have said out loud to anyone. The town of Magnetawan was small enough that new faces were noticed. Gerald made his first trip in for groceries on a Thursday, and by Sunday, he had been introduced to 3 people who recognized his father's name, 2 people who recognized his truck, and 1 woman at the hardware store named Bette Alcorn, who told him that his father had been a good man, and that she was sorry for his loss, which opened something in Gerald's chest that he quickly closed again before it could show. He was in the feed store the following week when he first heard his own name said in a way he didn't recognize. 2 men in the back corner, talking quietly. Gerald caught fragments. Sutton's boy. Ellis's son. You know what they said about him. He paid for his purchases and left without looking at them directly. He told himself it was nothing. Small towns had long memories and short contexts, and it was nothing. But then Father Brendan Alcott, who ran the non-denominational community church out of a converted Legion Hall on Magnetawan's Main Street, stopped by the farmhouse on a Wednesday afternoon. Gerald invited him in for coffee because his father had liked the man, or at least had liked the idea of him. Alcott was in his early 60s, trim and deliberate, with the particular manner of a person who has spent decades being listened to and now expects it automatically. He sat at the kitchen table and took his coffee without thanking Gerald for it, and said, in a tone that managed to sound concerned and conclusive at the same time, that he had heard Gerald was settling in, that it was good to keep the old properties in family hands, and that he hoped Gerald understood that some of the older members of the community remembered certain things from years ago that Gerald might want to be mindful of. Gerald asked him to be specific. Alcott said it wasn't his place to repeat details, only that Ellis had mentioned certain tendencies was the word he used, and that Gerald's abrupt departure from the region 30-odd years ago had not been forgotten. He said all of this carefully, softly, looking just past Gerald's shoulder rather than at him, in the way of someone delivering a message they are also refusing to own. Gerald sat with it for a moment. Then he said he wasn't sure what his father might have said or why, but that he had served in the Canadian Forces for 24 years, that he had retired honorably, that he had been married for 31 years to the same woman, and had asked no one in Magnetawan for a single thing in all the time he'd been away. Alcott nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something rather than addressed it, and left shortly after. Within a week, the shape of the thing became clear. Gerald had returned to a place that had already decided what he was. The decision had been made years ago, not by any evidence, but by a story, told by his father to Alcott and others, that Gerald had left because he'd had to leave, that there had been money involved, that there had been a problem that Ellis had quietly managed. None of it was true. Gerald had left because he and his father had been unable to inhabit the same world without one of them being diminished by it, and Gerald had been the one who could walk away, so he had. He'd built another life. He'd served, married, raised a son who now lived in Alberta and called twice a year. He had done nothing to be ashamed of. But shame, he was learning, doesn't require evidence. It only requires repetition and a room full of people willing to accept what they've been told. The mechanic in town declined to look at his truck. The woman at the general store stopped making eye contact. When Gerald walked into the diner on a Saturday morning, the conversation nearest the door stopped and didn't resume until he had sat down and was clearly not leaving. He drove the 45 minutes to Parry Sound to buy groceries. He stopped going to town unless he had to. The nights got harder again. He lay in the dark and listened to the farmhouse and understood, at 68 years of age, What it felt like to be a boy again in your own father's house. Invisible, undefended, surrounded by a world that had decided on you before you opened your mouth. Scout pressed closer. Gerald put his hand on the dog's side and felt him breathe, and didn't sleep until nearly 4 in the morning. He thought about leaving. He had nowhere to go, but he thought about it. And then came the 4th week of November. Scout had been fixated on the barn for days. Not the way dogs get interested in smells from curiosity, but the way they get interested when something is wrong or different or important. He would sit outside the barn door and look at Gerald with an expression that Gerald had learned, over 7 years, to take serious. Gerald had checked the barn twice and found nothing except the usual collection of old equipment, broken boards, and the smell of decades of hay and animal. On the 3rd day of this, Gerald decided to actually look. The barn floor was packed earth except in the back corner, where his father had at some point poured a rough concrete pad. Scout wasn't interested in the pad. He was interested in the area beside it, against the north wall, where someone had laid down old boards flat against the dirt floor. Gerald had assumed they were covering a soft spot. He pulled them up. Beneath them was a trapdoor. It was heavy, iron-fitted and swollen with moisture, and it took Gerald most of his strength to get it open. Below was a space, not large, maybe 6 feet by 8, with a wooden ladder descending into it. Gerald got the camp lantern and went down. The space was dry. Whatever his father had built it for, he had built it well. There were shelves along 2 walls, mostly empty, with a few old mason jars and what looked like seed packets from the 1980s. In the corner was a metal box, olive drab, the kind used for storage of documents or small equipment. Gerald recognized the type. He had used similar ones himself. The lock on the box was the kind that a flathead screwdriver could open if you knew where to apply pressure. Gerald knew. Inside was a manila envelope, taped shut, and beneath the envelope, wrapped in a cloth and taped at both ends, a smaller package. He took both upstairs and sat at the kitchen table. He opened the envelope first. Inside were documents. His father's will, or rather a different version of his father's will. Handwritten and dated 2019, 4 years after the typed version that had gone through probate. Gerald had received from the probate will what had been left to him. Nothing. The farmland had been directed to a rural land trust, with Alcott named as a trustee conditional on the land not passing to any of Ellis's children. The handwritten will was different. It left the farmland directly to Gerald. All 80 acres. No conditions, no trust, no intermediary. Below the will was a letter, folded 3 times, in his father's handwriting. Gerald read it slowly. His father had written it in the last months of his life, when he was still lucid but no longer pretending that he wasn't running out of time. The letter was not exactly an apology. Ellis Sutton had not been a man who apologized in plain language, but it was as close as he had ever come. He had written that he knew he had treated Gerald unfairly, that the story he had told about Gerald over the years was one he had constructed, because he hadn't known how to admit that Gerald had simply chosen a different life than the one Ellis had imagined. And this had felt, to a man of Ellis's generation and temperament, like a judgment. He had punished Gerald for a crime that wasn't a crime, with a story that wasn't true. He had written that he changed the will because he wanted the land to go to the person who would understand what it was. He had hidden the document because he had been afraid, not of Gerald, but of Alcott, who had become involved in Ellis's affairs during the years of declining health, and who Ellis had too late come to understand was not entirely motivated by generosity. He wrote that he was sorry it had taken him this long. Gerald sat at the table for a long time. Scout put his head in Gerald's lap without being asked, and Gerald held on to him the way you hold on to something when the floor under you has shifted. The smaller package contained a leather notebook. Inside the notebook, in careful columns, were records, years of records, of transactions between the land trust and an account registered in Alcott's name. The numbers were not large individually, but they accumulated. Over 12 years, the total was significant. His father had been keeping track, Gerald realized, not from the beginning, but from the moment he'd understood what was happening and had been too far into illness to do anything about it except document. Gerald called a lawyer in Parry Sound the following morning. He drove down with the documents and sat across a desk from a woman named Gwen Hartley, who had the kind of stillness that comes from spending years hearing things that should never have happened. She read through everything carefully, asked Gerald several precise questions, and told him that the handwritten will, if validated, would likely supersede the probate document, and that the financial records raised questions that would be of interest to more than one regulatory body. It took 4 months. Gerald stayed on the land through the winter. He cut firewood. He repaired the roof over the back bedroom. He drove to Parry Sound regularly for meetings. He did not go into Magnetawan unless he had to. And when he did, he said nothing about what was happening, because Gwen Hartley had advised him not to. And also because there was a particular satisfaction in being underestimated by people who had already decided on you. Scout seemed to understand that things had shifted. He still pressed close at night. He still woke Gerald at the exact moments when the old dreams were at their worst. But there was something in his bearing, something settled, as though the work he had started by sitting outside that barn door had now been done. In March, Alcott was formally notified that the land trust was under review. In April, the validated will was entered into the record. In late April, on a gray Thursday morning, Gerald Sutton drove into Magnetawan, parked in front of the Legion Hall, and walked into Bet Alcorn's hardware store because he needed new hinges for the barn door. Bet Alcorn looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she said she'd heard. She said she hoped he understood that most people in this town hadn't known what they were repeating, and that there was a difference, in her view, between cruelty and ignorance, though she acknowledged it wasn't much of a comfort to be on the receiving end of either. Gerald said he understood that distinction. He had made it himself a few times over the years. She gave him the hinges. She charged him fairly. When he turned to go, she said quietly that his father had come in once near the end, when he could still drive, and had sat at the counter for nearly an hour, without saying much of anything at all. She'd asked him once if he was all right. He'd said he was thinking about his son, that he'd spent a lot of years getting things wrong in that direction. Gerald stood at the door with his bag of hinges and thanked her. He drove home on roads he was beginning to know, by the particular lean of certain trees, the way the light came through the maples at different hours, the soft spot on the gravel near the second concession that he now knew to steer around. Scout had his head out the window despite the cold, ears streaming back, reading the air with the focused pleasure of an animal who knows exactly where he is going. The farmhouse appeared at the end of the lane the same as always. Gray boards, sagging porch, the bare crown of the old ash tree visible just above the roofline. Gerald pulled up and sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. He thought about his father in the hardware store, sitting at that counter, thinking about his son. He thought about the handwritten will, tucked into a metal box, under a trapdoor, under old boards, under 30 years of silence. He thought about Scout sitting in the cold outside a barn door for 3 days until Gerald finally paid attention. Some things, Gerald thought, wait a long time to be found. The finding doesn't undo the waiting, but it changes what the waiting was for. He got out of the truck. Scout was already at the farmhouse door, looking back over his shoulder with an expression of patient urgency that Gerald recognized completely. He'd been seeing it for 7 years. It always meant the same thing. Come on, let's go inside. We're home.